my name is Scott Dowley. I'm the VP of Product here at Foresite, and today's webinar is all about going through, to cloud or not to cloud, some do's and don'ts about security in the cloud, about decisions to be made to go into the cloud, all of the things that go through that. If you are a cloud expert already and you know everything there is to know about AWS, GCP, Azure, congratulations, friend. This webinar is not for you. You already know everything I'm going to talk about. If you are interested about cloud security or have some questions or maybe want to look for some additional knowledge, perhaps this would be a good place for you to gain said knowledge. So without further ado, let us jump right into it. So here's our agenda for today, right? General cloud info, can I, should I, what does security look like in the cloud, and what are some playbooks that I can employ to ensure that my cloud environment or my hybrid cloud environment is as secure as it could be. So cloud, right? Can you be more vague? Notice the picture down here. All of us, super nerds on the call are laughing because, there is no such thing as a cloud as far as we're concerned. It's just somebody else's server, which is absolutely true. But cloud really means a bunch of different things, right? Most of the time, and I'm speaking in a kind of a general sense for the small, medium-sized business or the enterprise market, when we refer to cloud, we're typically referring to IT operational functions, right? So email, file storage, things like Salesforce, all of those things are cloud-based things. So if you have Office 365, G Suite, you're already in the cloud. Some infrastructure is also in the cloud. A lot of organizations are moving all of their IT infrastructure from an on-premise data center, a data center you own and control, to a cloud-based data center like AWS, GCP, or Azure, right? So cloud really means specific business functions that you can offload to a third party in their own environment, i.e. their cloud. Or all of your business functions that can reside in a purely cloud-based environment to save you time, money, and effort, right? That's really what the cloud is built for. It's what it's designed for. So obviously there's questions there. So let's dive in a little bit deeper, right? Cloud native. What is cloud native? We hear this term getting thrown out all over the place all the time. I pulled this pulled the definition directly from Oracle. I didn't want to quote, just my own personal definition of it or just the general understanding, right? So according to Oracle, it's the concept of building and running an application specifically to take advantage of the distributed computing that is offered by a cloud environment, right? So when you hear a cloud native application, think of Salesforce, think of Dropbox, think of Outlook, right? These are all applications that were built from the ground up to work within the cloud and to work within a distributed architecture to be available at any time, to be available to anyone. That's the entire idea behind a cloud native application and the cloud in general. Availability is the strongest thing that a cloud provider brings to any function of an IT environment or a corporate business environment because it's always available. And that's the real niche, right? These cloud providers have data centers all over the globe. These data centers are massive and they're extremely, extremely redundant. It's very rare that you would see for example, a Google data center or an AWS data center or a Microsoft data center go offline. They're designed for redundancy. Therefore, the end result is you get a lot of very high availability for whatever application you are running. If it is a cloud native application that you are either building to run in the cloud or that you're taking advantage of that runs in the cloud, the idea is that it is always going to be available for you or your customers to be able to utilize. And again, that is the major advantage of anything in a cloud is extremely high availability. So can I cloud? And again, everybody keep in mind, this set of slides was done to talk to a bunch of small and medium-sized businesses that have yet to fully make the jump, right? So that is the kind of prism by which we built these slides and are kind of doing this talk today, right? So can I cloud, right? A lot of organizations have this question before they even go into it. Everybody gets dazzled by the lights, like, yes, we can save money and we can save CapEx and we can do all these things. But the question should be asked by every organization, can I, immediately followed by should I, right? So can I, right? What data am I going to store in the cloud? Is it business email? Is it personally identifiable information? Is it going to be traversing the cloud down to an organization, to a regular network? Is it going to go from cloud environment to cloud environment? These are all questions that you need to ask about the type of data that you have stored in the cloud or are using in the cloud, or the type of applications that you're using in the cloud as well, because depending on the answer to those questions, your regulatory requirements may change, or you may be introduced with some regulatory requirements depending on the type of data that you have located in the cloud, right? Are there any regulatory or laws governing my data? Again, I go back to PII, or personally identifiable information. It completely depends on the business that you're in. If you're a bank and you're storing your account holders' data in the cloud, well, a lot of that data equals personally identifiable information. Therefore, you as the bank, as the provider to that banking service, need to ensure that the data that you're storing in the cloud is protected in accordance with any PII controls that are out there. PCI is a big one. FFIEC is another big regulatory requirement. And those are simply a series of controls that you have to conform to ensure that the data that you're storing on behalf of a third party, a customer, a third party, a user, whatever, are in compliance with these regulatory requirements in order that if the data is breached, you're not held liable or your liability is lessened, right? So those are other things you have to worry about. What about geographic location restrictions, right? A lot of companies that we work with here at Foresite are specifically US based, and their market is the US market. Therefore, if you are going to go into the Alibaba cloud, which is out of China, is that a good idea to host your data in a Chinese, geographically located data center? Probably not. So when you're doing your research about, which cloud provider is right for you, then one of the things that you need to look at is where are their physical data centers located? Anybody can Google this right now. You can Google the AWS data center locations, the Microsoft data center locations, the Azure data center locations, and every one of these main providers have a map that shows you exactly where their data centers are located and what function their data centers perform. So if you go into a cloud environment, let me take a step back real quick. And I'm using the big three on purpose because most folks are going to use more likely AWS, GCP, or Azure. Those are the big three, especially in the US market. When you go into a cloud provider's environment, you don't necessarily get a choice about where exactly your data is going to be located within their data center ecosystem. Their job is to house your data, make it available to you or anybody else that you want as part of a high availability. But the actual physical location of that data is not up to you, the customer, right? So we, Foresite, we partner with AWS. We have a lot of our infrastructure in AWS. We do not get a choice about which data center our data is located in. All we are concerned with is, can we get access to the data when we need it to perform the functions that we do for our customers? If it is a big deal for your organization, if it's part of your risk tolerance, or if it's part of your risk profile where you cannot have any of your US-based data located outside the geographic boundaries of the continental United States or Alaska or Hawaii, that is indeed a significant consideration that you need to make, right? So it's all about asking your data center provider, where exactly is my data going to be housed, right? And again, you could be in a bunch of different data centers, but as long as they're inside of the geographic, providence of the US border, then you are okay for most regulatory compliances with respect to data safe harbor. I can't even think of the terms, but data safe harbor, data residency is typically the term that is used in a data center world or an online world about where that data is physically located, right? You can see here the FFIEC has not issued any regulations specific to if you're a US-based business, you have to have your data in the US. They haven't issued any regulations specific to that, but they have issued several guidelines, right? As of April 30th of this year, the guidelines that are out there that are the most current are security in a cloud computing environment. We can make this link available to everybody after this webinar is over with. But again, the FFIEC, besides maybe the PCI Council, are the two biggest organizations with respect to what data is allowed to be stored outside the continental US, depending on your business, right? And what data must reside within the continental US if you are a US-based business. And again, these are very generic statements. It completely depends on the business that you're in. It depends on who your customers are. It depends on whether or not you do contracts with local government, state government, federal government. It depends on whether or not your client base is predominantly located in the US. All of these things are considerations and factors that you have to think about before you go into a cloud environment, so that when your data is in the cloud, you are covered from a regulatory and compliance standpoint. And that's really what this slide is trying to get to, right? So as I said, once you ask the question of can I, the next follow-up question is should I, right? What is the objective of going into a cloud-based environment? What are we going to gain? What are we doing this for, right? There are some pretty common themes that kind of span across any business, right? It saves on capital expenditure, right? You don't have to spend the majority of your IT budget on actual physical servers, network switches, network infrastructure, and typically staff to maintain that. The cloud allows for a lot more flexibility. Again, going back to the previous slide, the biggest advantage of going into the cloud is massive availability, right? So when you go into the cloud, if you architect your environment correctly, it is a lot more flexible, a lot more fault tolerant, and a lot more disaster recovery redundant than a single data center that you may be using today, right? Obviously, if you have one data center located in one spot, you're basically going off of maybe one power provider, maybe two internet service providers, but it's one location. So if the power goes out in your area, you're kind of done. The advantage of going to the cloud is you can't really turn the power off at these massive data centers. I mean, you can, obviously, right? But it's very difficult to do, hence the high availability. Going into a cloud environment, you are going to expend some staff time in properly configuring your cloud environment to host your data. It doesn't matter if you're, a 5-man organization and you're a small law firm, or you're a big organization of several hundred people that are doing thousands of transactions a day for your customers. It doesn't matter what the scenario is. You have to ensure that when you go into a cloud environment, and again, using AWS, GCP, and Azure as our main candidates here, you have to ensure that you are architecting your cloud environment appropriately. Let me give you an example. Working in AWS, because again, Foresite does a lot of business with AWS, so we've learned a lot of lessons in AWS. One of the things that AWS will not tell you is it's very easy to get data into AWS. You can suck as much data, they don't care how much it is, what type of data it is. You can get all sorts of data into AWS, and it's very cheap, if not free. Getting that same data back out of the AWS cloud to another location is where it costs you money. So there are nuances that go with every cloud provider that you have to consider when you are architecting your cloud-based environment. And what I tell a lot of people is this: you need to look at your cloud environment much in the same way from a IT operations perspective and a security perspective that you look at an on-prem environment. There are basic tenets that you have to adhere to. It's basically a virtualized network in somebody else's environment. So you still need a firewall, you still need security, you still need a VPN concentrator if you desire one, you still need security controls in place, least privilege, role-based access control. All of these things are still true inside of the cloud. So if you are thinking that you're, immediately once we go into the cloud, we're going to be able to shed 5 staff on the IT department, I would tell you to probably reconsider that thought. It's going to take you a spin-up time to set up your organizational or operational environment in the cloud. So you're going to need staff for that, or contract that bit out. Either way, it's going to cost you money. And then as you're migrating all of your data into a cloud, whether you're going fully into the cloud or it's a hybrid environment, whatever the case is, you're going to need qualified staff on site, not on site, but on your payroll to ensure that your data is appropriately put in the cloud and everything is working the way it's supposed to work before you get rid of those IT staff. So my point here is you're not immediately going to see the benefits of the reduced CapEx and all that stuff. It will take a little bit of time, but the expenditure will be there, or the reduction in expenditure will be there down the road if done properly. I can tell you horror stories of companies that go into the cloud thinking they're going to save a lot of money. They do it wrong, or they don't pay close attention to what their setup is, and they end up spending, believe it or not, more money in the cloud than they would in an on-prem data center. Another big reason for that is if you are using, and it doesn't matter if you're using AWS, GCP, or Azure, if you are processing data in a cloud, you are being charged to process that data. Every time a virtual CPU fires off, or anytime a virtual disk is used to store data, there's a charge model for that. And the cloud providers are very, very good about ensuring that they are retrieving their dollars for the use of their services and the use of their virtual environment. So as you go into it, you have to kind of rethink the way that, in a way, that you do business. If there's a redundant thing that you're doing, should it be housed in the cloud, or should you retool how that redundant thing is being done? You don't want to unnecessarily just spin up servers, spin up workstations, spin up whatever in a cloud environment, because there is a cost to you. You might not see it right away, but you will definitely see it down the road as your cloud bill goes higher and higher month over month. And you have to get really into the weeds to figure out what's going on, right? The last bit is, for reasons the cloud is pretty much every single cloud environment will have more tools available to you to enable security. AWS has CloudTrail, Azure and GCP have their security control center, and Microsoft Defenders and Azure. There's a lot of tools that are available because a cloud today is simply an ecosystem. It is a system of systems. You have your base level IT infrastructure, you have all these applications that are written to work within that cloud environment, and you have these security overlay applications that you can subscribe to or are a part of your subscription natively that make it much easier for you to secure your data, secure your traffic, secure your transactions in the cloud. And there are a lot more tools available in a cloud environment than if you were to bring those tools into a physical brick and mortar data center, right? So that is yet another advantage that you get by going into the cloud. Some of the challenges, we've kind of already covered these, but OpEx, right? You're going to save in CapEx up front or right after you do your cloud transition, but your OpEx will likely go up. And the big reason for that, the decrease in CapEx, but the increase in OpEx is you're operating in a new environment. You're operating in an environment where everything that you do has a charge associated with it. So again, it's kind of rethinking the way that you do business from an IT operations or security standpoint, because every transaction that you do, every CPU that fires, every transistor that runs, whatever, there is a charge associated with that. So it's very, very important that you clearly architect your environment, understand what your objectives are by going into a cloud environment, and then also understand that there will be net new charges associated with your cloud usage that you wouldn't typically see in a brick and mortar data center, right? So just again, considerations that you need to make. And then talent, right? It is a different skill set, not entirely, but there is a learning curve. There is a different skill set to run an enterprise or an ecosystem in a cloud-based environment versus your traditional kind of hub and spoke network IT environment in a data center, in a physical data center, right? Most organizations, what they end up doing is they take their existing IT staff or a subset of their existing IT staff, and they simply train them in the cloud environment that they're choosing to go into. So they'll get them AWS certified, GCP certified, Azure certified, whatever. Because while the fundamentals are the same, there are nuances that are different about how to operate in a completely virtualized world. And that's what the cloud is, a virtualized world running on somebody else's hardware, right? So the talent is another consideration that you need to have it as an organization before you make the leap into the cloud environment. Otherwise, you're going to make the leap into the cloud environment, realize, oh crap, I don't have anybody that knows how to really make this work under the covers on staff. I got to go hire somebody, or I need to contract with somebody. That is an added expense that you hadn't budgeted or planned for. So it's important you make that consideration before going into it. The last challenge that we lay out here is any legacy systems. Every organization, I would dare say most organizations, not every, has a legacy system. If you're a bank, a lot of your systems run on COBOL, or older systems run on COBOL. If you're a manufacturing company, you have probably some machine that is, an IoT machine that is network connected that runs on some super old legacy software. Those are things that cannot transition to the cloud. So if you have any legacy systems, legacy applications, legacy devices that are critical to your business that cannot make the transition to the cloud, you have to come up with a game plan. Do you migrate away from that legacy application, that legacy thing that you're using in favor of something better? How much pain is associated with that? How much time is it going to take us to re-architect our way of doing business by not using this legacy thing? Or can I take this legacy thing and make it work inside of a cloud environment? There are instances where you can do that. But again, it comes down to how much knowledge you or your organization has operating in this cloud environment to see if this legacy application, this legacy thing will actually work. What a lot of organizations do, in my experience anyway, is they have to basically engineer their business away from that legacy application to take advantage of something newer that is offered in the cloud environment for the exact same reason I just laid out. The legacy system won't work in the cloud environment. They can no longer really justify the cost of keeping that legacy system around. So they go through the muscle movement of getting rid of that legacy system, transitioning to something new that is offered in the cloud that makes them more efficient in the long run. But it is a painful, kind of evolution to go through, but it is a consideration and needs to be thought of before you make the jump into the cloud. All right, security, right? Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. What happens if? What happens if this? A lot of the things that you have to deal with if you have your own data center are considerations that you still have to have going into the cloud from a data breach, a data security perspective, but the game changes quite a bit. In a cloud environment, the cloud provider, again, AWS, GCP, or Azure, they are not responsible for your security of your data at all. They are responsible for making sure that their IT or their cloud infrastructure is available for you to use. Beyond that, anything you put on top of that, that base level IT infrastructure, right? So if you're spinning up virtual servers, you're installing applications, you've got network traffic flowing in and out, that is your responsibility to secure that. So you need to ask a series of questions about, one, how do I secure this, and where is my liability in the cloud, right? So if the cloud vendor suffers a breach, right, and it's happened before, AWS has suffered breaches before, they're small. I believe Google suffered a breach in the last probably 6 months to a year. I can't name that one off the top of my head. But the cloud provider, if they suffer a breach, what data could potentially be exposed? Is your data potentially part of the exposure if a breach happens? It is different with every cloud provider. This is where your contract comes in to save you, right? If they have a breach, they should have a fiduciary responsibility to you or some sort of notification responsibility to you to say that your data was part of a breach. This is what was breached. And that way, you know, based on the data that was breached, what actions you can take next. I will tell you right now, if you're thinking that there's a way that you're going to be able to potentially, litigate a response out of a cloud provider, these are massive organizations that have a lot of money for lawyers. Not to say that it's impossible, but it is definitely a consideration you need to make. Because you're hosting your stuff in a third party, the risk of a breach is there. The same risk of a breach that you carry if you have your own IT data center that you are running, right? The risk of a breach is there. Because it's online, because it's always available, that means anybody can potentially get to it, right? So you need to have that as a consideration. What happens if the service goes down? Again, the major advantage of going into the cloud is their extremely high availability. But I'll give you a real world story that happened, I think, back in January, February of this year. Amazon lost one of their data centers in the Northeast. I believe it was US Data Center East 1. When they lost that data center, and they only lost it for 3 hours, but when they lost that data center, Alexas wouldn't work on the East Coast. Nobody could shop in the Amazon marketplace on the East Coast. The Ring doorbells stopped working on the East Coast. There were significant, outcomes from that one data center going down, right? So what happens if the service does go down? What liability does the cloud provider have? Can you handle, or can your business absorb the services that you use to run your business being offline for 3 hours, 5 hours, 10 hours, 2 days, right? What is your backup plan in the event that your cloud provider goes down? And what protections do you have in your contract to mitigate that threat or that potential outcome of a data center outage happening that you can use to protect yourself? These are all considerations that you have to think about, and they must be codified in your contract, because again, if it's not in your contract, nobody's liable for anything. It's not written down, right? What happens if the cloud service provider goes out of business with my data? I don't see this happening very often these days. Back in the day being 5 years ago, there were smaller cloud providers. Think of like cloud providers that provide like rural services to hard to reach places in the continental US or wherever. A lot of those cloud providers got bought up by larger organizations like your AWSs, your GCPs, your Azures. So what happens if that organization goes out of business with your data in their cloud? Typically, one of two things will take place. Number one, every single cloud provider that's out there, according to the FFIEC guidelines, and I believe the SEC guidelines for doing business in the US, they have to have a plan in place to either return or transfer that data that they have in their cloud environment to another party. So again, one of the two things that will likely take place is if they go out of business, you're going to get a notification saying they've gone out of business, and you're probably going to receive a hard drive and, in FedEx with all of your data on it that they were able to pull out of their cloud infrastructure. The more likely scenario is they're going out of business because they're getting bought up by somebody else, or somebody else took up enough market share in their particular operating space, but they're just going to roll into that larger company. At that point, what happens is your data becomes part of this other organization that has either bought them or taken over their market share, and your data simply gets transferred to another party. That restarts the process for you with respect to negotiating a contract to understand what happens in the event of a breach, what happens in the event that the service goes down. You now have a new player that you're dealing with. So these are all things that you have to be watching out for. So the real so what of this is when you choose a cloud provider, obviously you want to make sure that you're choosing a cloud provider that's giving you a good price, that's giving you the availability you want, that's giving you the flexibility that you desire to do the things you need to do in a day-to-day IT operation or security world. and that you understand what happens in the event that one of these catastrophes happen. Mr. Moore, who's on the call today, taught me something at NTT that I didn't know about. It's something called force majeure. There should be a force majeure provision in your cloud contract to say that, look, if a hurricane comes down or an earthquake happens, an act of God takes place and knocks out our data center or one of our data centers that's housing your data, you're kind of out of luck. You have to be looking for those things within your contract to ensure that you, again, are protected with your data, with your business operations. Vendor lock-in. Vendor lock-in is a real thing. Vendor lock-in just simply means, look, I'm in an AWS cloud environment. All of my services are AWS based. I really don't have like a Palo Alto or a Juniper or a Fortinet in the mix. It's all AWS. Well, that's called vendor lock-in, right? You are solely reliant on one vendor for the vast majority of your IT operational needs and your security needs. That is kind of dangerous. There are two real arguments to be made there. One, if you're in a vendor, if you're locked into a vendor to do all the things that you're doing from a business and an IT standpoint, you get the benefit of, if you're working with one vendor, every one of their applications is written to work with each other, or should be, right? So your seamless integration, your ability to do things easier if you're in a single vendor environment is there, right? It's easier for you to do things. The problem with that is if the vendor does something you don't like, they launch an update that breaks something, they decide to go in a different direction with their technology stack that you want, you have a real problem on your hand because now you're locked in via contract, right? So in the case of a cloud environment, again, AWS, GCP, Azure, what a lot of people do is they will use the AWS, GCP, Azure for their bare bones IT infrastructure needs to get that availability, but they will bring in like a Palo Alto firewall. They'll bring in a Cisco firewall or Cisco virtual switches, whatever the case is, to ensure that they are not locked into one vendor, so that if something goes horribly or catastrophically wrong with one of their vendors, they have the ability to move that data over or transition it to another vendor for another purpose, right? So vendor lock-in is real. It can happen to you. It happens kind of, under the covers. It happens over time, but it is something to be on the lookout for. All right, so risk-based approach. Again, the FFIEC guidance that we're providing here, we can provide post the webinar, right? So a lot of this stuff is stuff I've covered already. With any cloud provider or any vendor, honestly, that you're doing business with, contracts are your friend. If it is codified in a contract, there is a legal, a legal capability for you to ensure that both you and the third party that you're doing business with are following and adhering to the agreed upon terms to conduct your business. So what I'm saying here is, from a cloud perspective, if it's not written down in your contract, or if it can't be linked back from your contract like a master services agreement or a SAL, you really don't have any recourse. So it's really important, whatever the importance is for your organization, based on regulatory compliance, based on risk tolerance, based on risk posture, based on what happens if this happens, all of those things need to be written down in the contract with, if this happens, then this is the next step. Because again, if you don't have that in there, you're kind of on your own, and there's not really anybody who's going to be able to help you out, right? Controls are your friend, right? And what I mean here are regulatory controls or best practices. Every cloud environment, well, the big three for sure, they all have a best practices guide and a best practices assessment. Basically, are you doing things, are you configuring things in the cloud environment to the way that the vendor suggests that they should be done? So having a set of compliance controls that puts, controls within your environment that says basically, hey, you got to have role-based access control, least privilege or limited privilege. You got to have, more than two people that have access to everything. All this kind of stuff that goes into the controls, as well as your best practices assessment, are the two probably most fundamental things that you can do to ensure that your operating environment in the cloud is as secure as it can be. And it's all about the data, right? So we talked earlier about high availability. A lot of, actually pretty much every cloud provider uses, and I try to say the name and it escapes me now, but there is a specific file system, gosh darn it, I cannot think of it right now, but it's basically called sharding, right? So basically when your data goes into the cloud, a piece of that data, so say if it's a 200 megabyte file, 50 megabytes of that file will exist on the East Coast. The other 50 is going to exist somewhere in the Midwest. The other 50 is going to exist in the Midwest, and the other 50 is going to be somewhere else, right? So pieces of your files are located across the entire data center ecosystem. It is important for you as a customer of that data center company or of that cloud providing company to know exactly where your data is. Are they splitting your data out and distributing it amongst the rest of their data centers? Or are they corralling all of your data into one tenant and one data center and one physical location? And depending on the answer to that, are you okay? Do you accept the way that your data is being housed or stored or mixed up amongst the other customers of that cloud provider, right? In a typical cloud environment, you have what's called a cloud tenant. That is your tenant, that is your ecosystem, that is segregated just for your personal use. But on the back end of that, the way those files get saved is where the sharding starts to happen in some cases. So again, it's really important for you to know and have demonstrated in your contract exactly where your data is going to be stored, and any conditions that could come up that would, require your data to be moved elsewhere for additional high availability, or because they had an outage, or because an application wasn't working on their back end, whatever the case is, right? But knowing where your data is going to be physically stored is really, really important. Please don't go into a cloud environment and not know that, right? And the last bit, right, from a risk-based approach, oversight and monitoring, right? You can ask a cloud provider for a copy of all of their compliance controls, right? AWS has this on their homepage, so does GCP and Azure, right? They're ISO 27001 certified, they're SOC 2 certified, they've got all these certifications, right? It's important for you as a customer to look through those certifications to make sure that whatever controls you have as a business, let's say you are required as a business to be PCI certified because you have payment card data. Well, if you're going to go into a cloud environment that is not PCI certified, congratulations, you just opened up a risk for your business, because now you're storing your PCI or payment card info data in an environment that is not compliant with the PCI controls. So it's important that you look at all of the controls and the control frameworks that all of these cloud providers are adherent to ensure that it aligns to and matches with the compliance regulations that you have to abide by as a business. If you don't have any compliance controls, this is still a good step to take to know, in the eventuality that you have to comply with one of them, that you're already covered, or that you might have to move your data to another provider. Another thing that you can do that they don't really advertise is you can ask for a breach report out of a cloud provider. You can go to AWS, GCP, Azure and say, please provide me a copy of your latest breach report. And what that breach report is going to show you is any and all breaches that they are required to disclose under federal law to their customers. So you're going to be able to see, did they have a breach, with this specific data type? When was their last breach? Where was the physical location of the data center that suffered the breach? What was the application that caused the breach? What data was the breach able to, if it was an attacker, what data was the attacker able to get their hands on? Or if it was just a misconfiguration, somebody made a whoopsie, what happened to the data that for the customers because of that whoopsie? That breach report should detail all of that information out for you. It's a really boring thing to read, but it is very important for you to do going enter into this kind of agreement with a third-party cloud provider. All right, playbooks. Again, when we were in San Diego doing this brief, the big thing was about playbooks, right? And if you've been paying attention, hopefully everybody has, I've been giving you a lot of these playbooks kind of as we walk through this, right? So I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this slide, right? And I've got 7 minutes left. I was just notified. So we're gonna speed things up just a touch, right? Plan, do, check, act. These are pretty simple, fundamental things. Everybody should know how to do this, but no matter what cloud provider you're going into, make sure that you're aligning with your government or regulatory controls. Make sure that any specific policy controls that your business has, whether it was written by your business or written under a regulatory compliance that you would have to adhere to, are adhered to in the cloud. Make sure that any controls that you have to put in place can be put in place in a cloud environment, right? Make sure that all the things you need to do, in a nutshell, to operate securely on a day-to-day basis, you have the ability to do all those things in your cloud environment. Otherwise, there's no point in going, right? That's really what playbooks are inside of a cloud environment. And again, it's unique to each business. It's unique to each use case with each business, depending on what your business is, who your customers are, what type of data you have or that you want to put in the cloud, and what you intend on doing with that data, right? So these are the types of cloud offerings, right? And again, I'm assuming there is some cloud knowledge in the group, but we're going to go over the basics just in case, right? So SaaS, you're going to hear about this a lot. Dropbox, Outlook.com, Salesforce, I've already used those as examples. Twilio, oh my goodness, Blizzard. Those are all things that are SaaS products, right? SaaS is purely an application that was designed to be run in a cloud environment that uses its own cloud ecosystem to run. So when you go to Outlook.com, you're in the Azure ecosystem. Outlook is the application. It is a SaaS application, but it uses the Azure ecosystem to do what it does, right? So questions to ask if you're going into a SaaS environment. Say your company wants to purchase Salesforce. Salesforce is a SaaS product, right? Does that SaaS product have a third-party attestation? You can ask Salesforce for this stuff. Does it provide authentication? How do you authenticate to this application? Is it multi-factor? Is it username and password, right? What are your options there? Multi-factor should be a standard that everybody adheres to today, so it's important that you ask these questions, right? How does the vendor monitor their own platform? Think back to the SolarWinds breach of like a year plus ago, right? SolarWinds wasn't doing a very good job of monitoring their own SaaS ecosystem that allowed the breach to take place. So these are legitimate questions you can and should be asking anyway, right? What is the response policy for incidents? If the SaaS vendor suffers a breach, what is their response procedure? What are their SLAs to respond to that breach, right? And again, going back to the breach report, have there been, what are the incidents that have occurred in the last 12 months, 24 months, 36 months, whatever, right? You have the right to ask for this information. And finally, what is their business continuity plan? A SaaS provider exists only in the cloud. So if they've only got one data center, they really don't have a business continuity plan. They can't legitimately have one if they've only got one physical location. You need at least two. So these are all questions to ask. What is their network architecture? What's their geographic separation? All of these things will get you hopefully closer to the answers that you need to have the comfort level to go into the cloud with confidence. Infrastructure as a service, IaaS. A lot of people intermix SaaS and IaaS. I can't even say it. No, I'm not going to say the other one. A lot of people intermix these two. They are different. SaaS is purely software. You are accessing an application. Infrastructure as a service is exactly that. It is your physical infrastructure. It is your switches, your routers, your servers, your workstations. It is all those physical things or virtualized physical things that allow you to run an operation inside of the cloud, right? So when you're going into an infrastructure as a service offering, right, is the proposed service a full rebuild or a lift and shift? Are you going to have to re-architect your entire network when you go into this environment, or can you take what you have and simply replicate it into the cloud? If you're on a Windows environment today and you're going into Azure, for example, there is a tool that Microsoft provides that will simply scan your network and allow you to completely rebuild everything without doing very much work at all. You just have to validate the end results. AWS, I think, has the same kind of thing. I'm not sure if Google has it, but those are questions to ask. How can you guarantee uptime in an IaaS world, right? What are the SLAs that should be codified in the contract? What is the cloud service provider's policy on data access and destruction? How do they get rid of old hard drives when they cycle them out? How do they get rid of old network cards? What is their data destruction policy? Do they have a data destruction policy, right? These are good questions to ask. How would we get our stuff back? This is probably this, if you take nothing else away from this entire webinar, this is one of the main ones. How do we get our data back if we decide to stop using the cloud service provider? Every cloud service provider is different. If you decide that you do not want to renew your contract with an AWS, a GCP, Azure, there should be an exit strategy that you as a business have, but also an exit strategy that is provided by the cloud service provider. I no longer want to do business with you. I want to get my data out. How do I do that? For the most part, it's a simple copy and paste. You just find your data repository, whatever it happens to be, and you copy it down, but it can get more complicated. Say you've got databases involved. Say you've got physical or virtual infrastructure that you need to replicate outward. Your exit strategy needs to incorporate all of these things to ensure that all of the data you're getting out of the cloud is the right data you're getting out, plus it's all of the data you're getting out, plus you're able to make use of that data once you get it out, right? Let's see here. Are our employees comfortable with the chosen cloud platform? It's a business decision to go into the cloud. If you're a decision maker that's looking to go into the cloud, you have to think of what is our chat platform going to be, right? What's our email platform going to be? Is everybody able to use this? Can people make it to take advantage of this? Or are we going to have a massive training problem on our hands because we're using something that nobody else has ever used before in the organization? Got to think about that. And again, will my legacy applications have any issue running in the cloud? It is very important that you talk to your IT staff to find these legacy applications, find these legacy systems to identify, one, do I have any? Two, can they be run in the cloud, or do I have to set up some hybrid situation where this legacy application can send data to the cloud? All of these things have to be thought through and architected before you make the jump. Moving forward, this is the last slide, and it's basically talking about how to build a cloud native app. I'm not going to spend really any time on this other than to say this. If you are an organization that is looking to build a cloud native application, there is an entire set of instructions and regulations and things you need to go through to build that cloud native application. It depends on, do you want to host it on the App Store, the Apple App Store? Do you want to post it on the Google Play Store? Is this application going to be something that runs specifically in an AWS or a GCP or Azure environment? Does it need to be agnostic to any of these environments, right? What is the base code structure that's going to run? These are all considerations you have to make. But I will admit, most organizations don't really build a cloud native application as kind of a hobby. They usually partner with a third party that has specialties in doing the cloud native application build, and they simply take the requirements from you, the customer, and build that application for you in the cloud. My advice would be to go that route because, again, that is an entire rabbit hole of things that you have to be good at in order to do it well so that the application works properly within whatever cloud environment you want it to. Right. So yes, that brings us to the end of the webinar.
If you are interested in any more information about cloud migration, please feel free to reach out to us either using the contact box on your screen right now or by visiting our website. Thank you again and have a great rest of your day.